Well, hello everyone. My name is Alison Kenney and I used to work as an archivist for many years at the City of Westminster Archive Centre. And I'd like to introduce Matthew Houlihan, who is an actor. And today we're going to be looking at some of the seedier side of Covent Garden life in the 18th century, and also comparing it to present day conditions.
This print looks very dark. What does it show exactly? It looks like a young man in Georgian costume, flanked by two women, with a lighter boy holding a torch in front of them.
Yes, you're right. It is a nighttime scene from the middle of the 18th century. Covent Garden is a great place for young people to go out socialising in the 21st century, and so it was over 200 years ago. In fact, it had quite a reputation for ladies of the night. In other words, prostitutes, with their madams or bawds, who were older women who ran the brothels.
So who's this young man with his fancy brocaded jacket on?
Well, this print, if we look here, it's called Teague's Ramble at Charing Cross. And if we read the poem at the bottom, we can see that he's a young Irishman who goes out on the town to enjoy himself, but lives to regret it. Can you see what the poem actually says?
Yes. Low, rambling Teague with vacant visage jogs, far from his barren wilds and native bogs. A link boy points the thoughtless oaf his way, so will-o'-the-wisp off leads the kern astray. A nymph and bawd his wandering footsteps wait, and leave his pockets empty as his pate. The raving Rakehill finds too late his loss, then curses night intrigues and Charing Cross. That's very funny.
Yes, it's a marvellous little ditty, isn't it?
A little bit racially prejudiced towards Irish people, I
yes,
think.
yes. That might strike home a bit there,
Yes,
Matthew.
yes, as an Irish descended person, it is a little. But I suppose that's the prejudice of the time.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Well, I suspect that many a young man found himself in a similar position at the end of a good night out.
Yes, and he looks as if he's got his arm around the young woman, the nymph, there to his left, while the older woman, the bawd, is dipping her hand into his pocket while he's distracted. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's exactly what happened. And incidentally, one of the first researchers I dealt with when I was started working for Westminster in 1982 was Mr. E.J. Burford. I think he was Edward Burford, who was a specialist in 18th century prostitution in the Covent Garden and St James's areas. And he wrote several books which are on the search room shelves in the City of Westminster Archive Centre.
Wow. Anna, this print looks like a Hogarth, but what is going on here? I mean, it all looks pretty riotous.
Yes, indeed. It is a print by Hogarth called Morning. And it shows Covent Garden Piazza with the portico of St Paul's Church here on the left. And you can actually recognise the large Georgian house on the right here at the end of King Street because it is still there. And as you say, it is a pretty riotous scene. If we look in detail, on the left we've got one young man here kissing a young woman who has fruit on her lap. There's another man wearing what looks like a tricorn hat, basically shoving his hand down the front of another young woman's dress. And then the older woman in the centre, who we see here, she's got a lot of pockmarks on her face. And I suspect she is a bawd or brothel keeper who had worked as a prostitute herself when she was younger and caught a sexually transmitted disease, which is showing on her face. The bawds could become quite wealthy from their trade.
But the sign under the roof in front of the portico of the church here looks like Tom King's Coffee House. Now, it looks as though there's an actual sword fight going on through the doorway.
Yes, there certainly is a sword fight going on there. Some man's wig has come off and is flying through the air.
Was Covent Garden a fruit and vegetable market in those days?
Yes, it was, until the move to Nine Elms in 1974. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner here, you can see some strategically placed carrots and mushrooms. Now, Knowing Hogarth, I suspect these are symbolic of the general goings-on in Covent Garden at that time, if you get my drift. And I don't think I'm being unduly vulgar in suggesting this.
No, that's fair. I know that Alfred Hitchcock's father was a fruit and veg seller in probably up until the closing in 1974. So that's really interesting.
Yes. Well, this is a famous frontispiece of Harris's list of Covent Garden ladies, or Man of Pleasure's calendar from 1793. And it does give us a pretty good indication of what is going on in this area.
Now, it looks a bit like the three Graces in the picture here, except that there seems to be a fourth one sitting down. Now, if I'm reading this right, it says the histories and some curious anecdotes of the most celebrated ladies now on the town, or in keeping, and also many of their keepers. Now, I expect that being on the town means that they are working as prostitutes, patronised by a number of men paying for their services. And in keeping means being a mistress of a wealthy man who's paying all her expenses for housing, food and clothing, a bit like a sugar daddy.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. It reminds me of some of Samuel Richardson's novels, like Pamela and Clarissa, which were written in the middle of the 18th century, and indeed Bold Flanders by Daniel Defoe, written in 1722.
So do we know who this Harris was, and was the 1793 edition a one-off? Or?
Well, it says at the bottom of the frontispiece there that it was printed for H. Ranger, formerly of 23 Fleet Street, at 9 Little Bridges Street, near the Drury Lane Playhouse, where previous editions could be seen. Now, doing a bit of research for this on the internet, it seems that the probable author was a man called Samuel Derrick, who was a friend of John Harrison, alias Jack Harris, who was head waiter at the Shakespeare Head Tavern. And the full set of books covers the period from 1757 to 1795. Interestingly, there was a directory of ladies of pleasure in Edinburgh published in 1775. So obviously books of this kind are not confined to London. And you can find out more about this by reading Hallie Rubenhoe's excellent book on Covent Garden in the 18th century, which is on the search room shelves at the City of Westminster Archive Centre.
Now, how much does Harris's list tell us about the young women involved in the sex trade at this time?
Well, a common theme, I'm afraid, seems to be that a lot of these young women had moved to London from the country, where they had been deflowered, for want of a better word. And then, having been thrown out of domestic service by their master and mistress, or thrown out by their own family for their misdemeanours, they had little choice to support themselves but to move to London and place themselves on the town or in keeping. Interestingly, although they were plying their trade in Covent Garden, most of them lived in the eastern part of Marylebone, between Tottenham Court Road and Cavendish Square, especially Newman Street. Now, some of them lived in South Moulton Street in Mayfair, which is just south of Oxford Street, and some in Chelsea.
Does it say what sort of services they offered as a guide?
Indeed it does. And in surprisingly graphic detail, actually, a bit like the prostitute stickers that one used to see on telephone boxes about 20 or 30 years ago. There was quite a lot of kinky stuff going on, especially the birch, administered by the older women, the dominatrix type. For the younger women, there's usually a physical description of their faces and bodies, with terms like amorous eyes or panting orbs, you can guess what that is, and a note of how much they charge, which was anything from 5 shillings to 5 guineas per session. And apparently their clients were lawyers from the Temple, bankers from the City of London, country vicars, and players from the Covent Garden Theatre.
Wow! And are we able to have a look at one of these entries in the book?
Yes, certainly. One of the entries I used to show at tour parties when doing guided tours at the Westminster Archive Centre is this one of Miss Wells of 35 Newman Street. And it says, "Virtue is the surest guide." This is a young genteel girl of the Welsh breed, of which she is not a little proud, and thinks that the blood of Owen Tudor runs in her veins. She is willing to do business with anyone. She is as wild as a goat, and of a sandy colour. Her features are small, and is a tight little piece. Great to think what that means. This lady is said to be the daughter of a farmer in Wales, who sent her to London very young to be under the care of an aunt, with whom she had not long resided before a young gentleman ingratiated himself so far into her graces as to gain her consent to make him happy by her ruin, under a promise of marriage. But no sooner had enjoyment damped the ardour of his love than he abandoned her to the reproaches and calumny of a merciless world, till at length, with shame and disappointment, she quitted her aunts and entered on the town. There is one thing to be said of her, which is, if she had not quitted the paths of virtue, she might have proved an honour and an ornament to her sex, as she is possessed of every good and amiable quality to make this true. Her customers, whenever inclined to pay her a visit, are always sure to be received with the behaviour and politeness becoming a person in a higher station. She is, like many others, mighty good-humoured when pleased. If you give her a piece of gold before you enter the premises, she goes to work with great affability and sweetness of temper. But if not, she is cool enough and thinks of nothing but the money during the time of enjoyment.
Wow. That is so. It's such
yes.
It's so narratively
yes,
written.
Yes, it is. It is. It's a sad story, really, isn't it?
It is actually a sad
yes,
story,
it
and it rather lends itself to kind of exploitation.
Yeah.
Or the enjoyment of exploitation on the part of a client.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. It's like the sort of website of that era,
yes.
you know.
It is a directory.
A profile is presented, a directory.
Yes, a directory.
It's extraordinary.
Yes. Oh, it is an extraordinary sort of historical record. Yes.
Because
we're very lucky to have it surviving, really.
Yes, and people of our era would ordinarily, I imagine, that period was sort of quote unquote more virtuous than this, but of course that's quite the reality is quite different.
Not the case at all, Matthew. Certainly in the 18th century, everything's pretty much out in the open, actually, as we saw with the Hogarth print. You know, a lot of it going on out in the open. The sort of Victorian values that we think of as outwardly respectable men having their way with ladies of the night in the 19th century, whereas of course the wife was expected to be very dutiful at home. The sort of strictness of Victorian morals is always attributed to Queen Victoria. But actually, she was quite racy. The young Queen Victoria was quite racy. Had very, very physical interest in Prince Albert, and of course they did have an awful lot of children. So they'd obviously had an awful lot of sex to produce the awful lot of children.
Yeah.
And I think rather it was Albert who was rather more stiff in morals and gave rise to the idea of Victorian values than Queen Victoria herself.
That's very interesting.
But yes, I think what is interesting for a 21st century audience is to see how out in the open it was in the 18th century.
Yeah.
They tend to think that, it all started in the 1960s. Well, no, it didn't. Those entries are, particularly for the older women, are very, very explicit indeed. So I brought you one of the more decent ones, because we might be done under obscene publications act if we gave you some of the racier ones there. But it's a great snapshot of history, isn't
it?
Really?
Much like the people of today. It's very interesting.
Yes, it is very, very interesting. And as I did guided tours at the Archive Centre, what I found was, although people loved to see what was different in previous years, what always excited them when they saw the archives and prints in the City of Westminster Archive Centre was where they were the same, where people from history were the same. Well, there's no reason why they shouldn't be the same, but that is what captivated people. Oh, it's just like today, you know. Well, yes, it was. Right, well, the next document we're going to look at shows that it wasn't only the affluent who were up to hijinks in the Covent Garden area.
Now, it looks like the pages of a book. What actually was it?
Well, this was the settlement examination book of the parish of St Martin in the Fields, which was a vital part of the poor law system, whereby anybody in need of poor relief from the parish had to be examined, or interviewed in other words, by the officials to establish whether they had a legal right to it, by dint of having been born in the parish, or renting property worth £10 a year, or being a yearly hired servant. And in this case, we're looking at the examination of Catherine Austin, aged 21, who was an unmarried mother.
Now, but why had she gone to the parish officials?
Well, the workhouse was about the only place where she could get any medical attention. And what is astonishing about this text is the amount of detail she gives about the circumstances of the conception of the baby. Let me read it out to you. So it says at the top here, the examination of Catherine Austin, single woman, lodging at Mr Robinson's, the Harlequin, a pub I would imagine, in Drury Lane in the parish of St Martin in the Fields, taken upon oath this 17th day of October 1754. This examinant, upon her oath, saith that she is 21 years of age and never was married, bound an apprentice, kept house, rented a tenement of £10 by the year, paid any parish taxes, nor been a yearly hired servant in any one place for 12 months together. And this examinant upon her oath says that she is now great with child or children, which is or are likely to be born a bastard or bastards, and to become chargeable to the said parish of St Martin in the Fields. And that James Southgate, a proctor in Carter Lane, Doctors' Commons, had carnal knowledge of her body about the beginning of the month of January last, in and upon a bed in a room up 2 pair of stairs forwards in the house of Mrs Sloper in Bow Street, Covent Garden, and several times afterwards at the same place, at which, or one of which times, he, the said James Southgate, did beget her with child or children she now goeth with, and is pregnant of, and that he, the said James Southgate, is the true and only father thereof, and no man else. The mark of Catherine Austin. So she can't write, but they have written her name out to the parish officials, and she has put a cross there.
Now, it says that the father of the baby was a proctor in Doctors' Commons. Now, what was that?
Doctors' Commons was a society of civil lawyers, and I think reading between the lines, it sounds as if he was of a higher social class than Catherine, though it doesn't actually tell us anything about her background. She's certainly going to be short of money once she's had the baby.
Right, and so would the parish authorities have gone after James Southgate for money for the baby?
Yes, that was certainly the idea. That's why Catherine says at the end that he was the father of the child and no other man was. Right. And obviously more recently, in more recent times, we've had things like the Child Support Agency pursuing absent fathers for money to support their children. But, today the looser family structure where cohabitation has, to a certain extent, succeeded marriage as the norm, has really made the whole concept of illegitimacy largely redundant. So it's rather a different setup these days. But I hope you've enjoyed this look with us through some of the Georgian underworld, and it's quite a colourful and vivid picture of what life was like in that area. And so I mentioned some books during the course of our little tour here, and they can be seen on the shelves of the City of Westminster Archive Centre, which is at 10 St Anne's Street, London SW1P 2DE. And this is a short walk from St James's Park Tube Station. It's actually just round the corner from Westminster Abbey. And it's open from Tuesday to Saturday, open at 10 o'clock in the morning, And Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday it closes at 7 o'clock in the evening. Friday and Saturday it closes at 5 o'clock in the evening. And since the start of the pandemic, they have been asking researchers to make an appointment to visit. So you need to either ring 0207 641 5180, or you email archives@westminster.gov.uk. So you might like to consult the website www.westminster.gov.uk/archives, and the staff will be pleased to help you with your inquiries and to show you more of these marvellous items from the collection.